The global spotlight shifted to Alaska, an unconventional but symbolically rich location for a high-profile diplomatic summit. Alaska, with its rugged terrain, remote geography, and harsh climate, immediately set the tone. This was not a routine meeting, but a strategic display of power, control, and stagecraft. For Donald Trump, the location itself became part of the narrative. Far from the typical halls of European diplomacy or the corridors of Washington, the setting reinforced the perception that Trump operated beyond conventional norms, commanding the scene both literally and figuratively. Trump's arrival was a carefully choreographed performance. Unlike many diplomatic events where protocol dominates, here every gesture, glance, and movement was deliberately designed to assert authority. Vladimir Putin, the long-standing ally in Trump's narrative, was given red carpet treatment, first seating, and priority attention. The optics were unmistakable. The US recognized Putin as a strategic partner, signaling to both allies and adversaries that the Kremlin held influence and favor in Trump's calculations. In contrast, EU leaders were relegated to less prominent positions, subtly emphasizing a hierarchy, those who were allies versus those expected to pay their protection fee. This distinction set the stage for a meeting where narrative, optics, and power dynamics would intertwine. Trump's opening remarks reinforced these themes. He emphasized results, accountability, and leadership, framing the conversation around what the US expects from its allies and partners. Instead of focusing on routine diplomatic niceties, he highlighted obligations, contributions, and compliance, effectively signaling that this summit was not simply about discussion but about enforcing American priorities. Analysts noted that his language was carefully crafted. Words like ally, responsibility, and protection fee were repeated to ensure that the framing was clear and persistent. From a visual perspective, Trump dominated the room. Cameras captured his posture, gestures, and interactions, projecting a sense of control and decisiveness to both attendees and global viewers. Each handshake, each nod to Putin, and each glance toward the EU leaders reinforced a hierarchy. Observers noted that Trump managed the sequencing of arrivals, controlling who entered when and who was photographed alongside whom. These details, though subtle, were critical in establishing psychological dominance before any substantive negotiations took place. Beyond optics, the meeting's design emphasized psychological leverage. Trump's choice of Alaska signaled independence, strength, and strategic awareness. The remote location limited distractions, minimized protocol interference, and allowed the US to dictate the flow of events. By controlling these factors, Trump ensured that attendees, whether allies like Putin or fee-paying nations in the EU, were operating within the environment he set, both mentally and physically. The media played an essential role in amplifying this strategy. Coverage highlighted Trump's confident entrance, his interactions with Putin, and the slightly delayed arrival of European leaders. By framing the narrative visually and contextually, Trump projected US dominance without needing to explicitly state it. The audience, both domestic and international, understood that the meeting was as much about perception as it was about policy. Analysts have called this approach performative diplomacy, where the leader leverages setting, optics, timing, and media to reinforce leverage. In Alaska, every detail was optimized. Seating arrangements, ceremonial gestures, the timing of remarks, and the sequence of meetings all contributed to a psychologically controlled environment. Trump's methodology demonstrates a deep understanding of the interplay between negotiation, power dynamics, and media narrative, an approach that forces all participants to react within his framework rather than pursuing their own agenda. The meeting's strategic underpinnings were also clear. By signaling who held priority, Putin, and who needed to adjust behavior or increase contributions, EU leaders, Trump established expectations and consequences. This initial phase of the summit was not about agreement or compromise. It was about establishing dominance, framing obligations, and asserting US priorities. Every leader in the room immediately understood the hierarchy, and the world's media narrative reinforced it globally. Finally, the opening set the tone for subsequent engagements. By asserting control, Trump ensured that both Zelensky and the EU leaders would operate under his terms, psychologically and diplomatically. The combination of location, narrative framing, media optics, and personal performance created an environment where US priorities could be advanced with maximum leverage. This opening phase was both political and theatrical, demonstrating a mastery of modern media-driven diplomacy that blends traditional negotiation tactics with psychological and performative strategies. In sum, the opening scene in Alaska was more than a simple introduction. It was a carefully orchestrated statement of power, designed to establish hierarchy, set expectations, and ensure that Trump would control both narrative and negotiation outcomes for the remainder of the summit. The first moments of the summit in Alaska were meticulously designed to establish Trump's dominance and set the tone for the entire meeting. Unlike traditional diplomatic events where all leaders are treated with equal ceremonial attention, Trump leveraged the arrival sequence, staging, and optics to reinforce a clear hierarchy. From the moment he entered the room, it was apparent that the summit would be as much about performance and perception as about policy. Vladimir Putin, long considered a key ally in Trump's foreign policy vision, was greeted with red carpet treatment, priority seating, and the most prominent position on the dais. Every handshake, nod, and eye contact with Putin was calculated for maximum visual impact. In photographs and broadcast footage, Trump and Putin appeared aligned, almost as equals, while the European leaders, arriving later, were subtly positioned as secondary. This placement alone conveyed a powerful symbolic message. Russia was a trusted partner. Europe was expected to meet obligations. Trump's body language was deliberate and commanding. Observers noted his upright posture, direct gaze, and slow, deliberate movements, all of which signaled control and confidence. By controlling the physical space, Trump conveyed psychological authority. Every step he took, every hand extended, and every pause in speech reinforced the narrative that he was the central figure in the room. In contrast, the EU leaders' slightly delayed arrival, combined with their placement at the margins, made them appear reactive and subordinate, a subtle but effective form of influence that would persist throughout the meeting. The room itself was a carefully curated stage. Alaska's dramatic natural backdrop provided a sense of grandeur and isolation. Large windows frame snow-capped mountains, creating a visual impression of strength, resilience, and the frontier spirit. All qualities Trump wanted to associate with the U.S. presence. Lighting, seating arrangements, and camera angles were all optimized to emphasize Trump's position at the center, Putin as the favored ally, and the EU leaders as secondary participants. The entire opening sequence was essentially a masterclass in media-driven diplomacy, where perception was engineered to match political objectives. Beyond optics, Trump's verbal approach reinforced his dominance. His opening remarks were carefully calibrated to assert expectations, obligations, and authority. Instead of focusing on abstract ideals or traditional pleasantries, Trump emphasized measurable contributions, accountability, and the strategic interests of the United States. Analysts noted that his language, words like ally, responsibility, protection, and obligation, was repeated and framed to create a psychological impression of U.S. leverage. By repeating these concepts, he ensured that both attendees and viewers at home understood who held power and who was expected to comply. The interactions in the opening minutes also illustrated Trump's mastery of psychological negotiation techniques. By giving Putin early attention and delaying engagement with EU leaders, Trump created a sense of urgency and minor anxiety for the latter group, signaling that they would need to prove their value through compliance and financial commitment. This subtle tension allowed Trump to control the emotional and cognitive environment in which discussions took place, ensuring that he would set the terms and pace of subsequent negotiations. Trump's use of humor and personal engagement further reinforced his position. Even in the opening moments, light jokes and casual asides were strategically employed to disarm allies and unnerve opponents. By establishing a friendly rapport with Putin and adopting a slightly teasing but authoritative stance with EU leaders, he reinforced the dual narrative: Russia as a partner, Europe as a contributor to be persuaded or pressured into alignment. These techniques are a hallmark of Trump's performative diplomacy, where every action serves both substantive and symbolic purposes. Another critical component of the opening scene was the control of media narrative. Cameras captured key gestures, expressions, and sequences, amplifying the intended perception to a global audience. The sequence of arrivals, the positioning of leaders, and the framing of remarks were designed for maximum visual and narrative impact. The world's press and social media were immediately presented with a clear story. Trump was in charge, Putin was an ally, and Europe was expected to meet U.S. expectations. This careful orchestration demonstrated how modern diplomacy increasingly relies on media optics as a tool of influence. Trump also established psychological dominance through pacing and timing. He controlled the speed of conversation, the allocation of attention, and the flow of interactions. By directing when questions were answered, when remarks were made, and when side conversations occurred, he reinforced his role as the central authority. Even small details such as pauses, eye contact, and nods were used to signal approval, authority, or disapproval, subtly guiding the behavior of all participants without overt confrontation. Finally, the opening scene was a clear demonstration of strategic planning combined with theatrical execution. Every element, from the venue, backdrop, and staging to gestures, speech, and timing, was orchestrated to establish Trump as the dominant figure in global negotiations. This opening phase set the tone for all interactions that followed, from Zelensky's face-off to the eventual confrontation with EU leaders. By controlling both psychology and optics, Trump created a situation where all parties operated under his terms, enhancing U.S. leverage and ensuring that the summit would proceed in a manner favorable to his strategic objectives. The second major segment of the Alaska summit focused on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who arrived in a room already dominated by Trump's narrative and controlled optics. Unlike the opening with Putin, this interaction was designed to demonstrate Trump's ability to manage allies under pressure, leveraging psychology, performance, and subtle power dynamics to secure tangible outcomes. Zelensky's arrival was marked by visible nervousness and anticipation, reflecting the high stakes of meeting a leader who had established dominance from the outset. Even seemingly minor decisions, such as what to wear, a formal suit or a more casual sweater, became symbolic of the pressure Zelensky faced. The choice of attire reflected not just personal preference, but an understanding of the psychological environment Trump had created. By carefully observing and responding to the cues set by Trump, Zelensky immediately entered a room where the power dynamics were predetermined. From the beginning, Trump used strategic humor and casual remarks to disarm Zelensky while simultaneously asserting control. Light jokes about protocol, the weather, or local Alaska culture served a dual purpose. They reduced tension superficially, but more importantly, they shifted Zelensky into a psychologically subordinate position. Humor in this context functioned as a tactical negotiation tool, establishing Trump's authority while allowing Zelensky to respond within the framework Trump had designed. The meeting's visual design reinforced U.S. leverage. Large detailed maps of Ukraine adorned the walls, prominently highlighting Russian territorial advances. These visuals were not just decorative. They served as constant reminders of the strategic realities facing Ukraine and the U.S.'s position as the decisive partner in defense and support. By keeping these maps in Zelensky's line of sight, Trump reinforced a subtle yet powerful narrative. U.S. support is contingent upon cooperation, financial commitment, and strategic alignment. During the discussion, Trump's rhetoric emphasized obligation, contribution, and reciprocal benefit. Whereas previous diplomatic engagements might have focused on abstract principles or encouragement, Trump's approach was direct. The United States would provide support, but only in exchange for tangible commitments, including major arms purchases and alignment with U.S. strategic objectives. This was a masterclass in combining psychological influence with policy negotiation, where verbal cues and framing had as much impact as substantive agreements. Throughout the session, Trump carefully managed pacing and attention. By alternating between casual conversation, pointed questions, and strategic pauses, he kept Zelensky off balance and ensured that the Ukrainian president responded on Trump's terms. Even minor gestures such as nodding approval, leaning forward, or momentarily looking at his watch conveyed subtle messages about compliance, urgency, and authority. Observers noted that Zelensky frequently adjusted his posture, tone, and facial expressions in response, signaling the psychological impact of Trump's controlled environment. Media optics were central to this segment as well. Cameras captured every handshake, every glance at the maps, and every visible reaction from Zelensky, amplifying the narrative to a global audience. Images of the two leaders, Trump relaxed, in control, and gesturing confidently, Zelensky attentive, cautious, and responsive, reinforced the story. The US controlled the terms, Ukraine would comply, and the summit was a performance of strategic dominance. Another key factor was Trump's selective focus and attention management. While Zelensky was the center of this segment, Trump also intermittently engaged with other aides and visual cues, subtly reminding the Ukrainian delegation that they were operating within a larger geopolitical context. These tactics reinforced a sense of hierarchy, signaling that decisions were being observed and evaluated in real time. This careful orchestration ensured that negotiation outcomes favored the US, while Zelensky's responses aligned with Trump's strategic objectives. The culmination of this face-off was the agreement on massive US arms purchases. While superficially a policy decision, it was also a demonstration of Trump's ability to secure tangible results through psychological leverage and performance-based negotiation. The agreement underscored the broader principle that US support comes with expectations, reinforcing the ally obligation framework established in the opening sequence. This segment also highlighted Trump's understanding of audience and narrative control. Every moment, from humor to visual cues to the framing of maps, was designed to be captured by media outlets and circulated globally. By controlling the narrative externally as well as internally, Trump ensured that the summit's outcomes would be perceived as a clear demonstration of US strength and strategic leadership. Global observers would not only see the agreement itself, but also understand the psychological dominance and negotiation acumen that made it possible. In summary, the Zelensky face-off was a masterful demonstration of performative diplomacy, psychological leverage, and negotiation skill. By combining environmental control, visual cues, humor, pacing, and direct rhetoric, Trump ensured that Zelensky understood the hierarchy and the US's terms of support. Tangible policy outcomes, major arms purchases, were achieved. The global audience received a clear message about US leadership and influence. Psychological leverage was maximized without overt confrontation. The face-off exemplified how modern diplomacy can blend media optics, psychological strategy, and traditional negotiation tactics. It was a controlled environment where Trump dictated terms, guided behavior, and ensured results aligned with US strategic interests. Zelensky's cooperation demonstrated that even allies operating under pressure will comply when both perception and policy are skillfully aligned. Ultimately, this segment of the Alaska summit reinforced a recurring theme. Trump's mastery of narrative, performance, and leverage allows him to secure both psychological and substantive victories. The combination of environmental control, media management, humor, and direct negotiation created a scenario in which Trump could achieve measurable outcomes while maintaining the appearance of effortless dominance. After the opening with Putin and the face-off with Zelensky, the summit shifted to the arrival of European Union leaders, a segment that would underscore Trump's dominance and the contrast in how he managed allies versus fee-paying partners. While the optics of the Alaska venue had already conveyed authority, the entrance of the EU leaders added a new layer: public pressure, negotiation leverage, and symbolic demonstration of hierarchy. The EU delegation, often referred to in media shorthand as the Seven Dwarfs, due to their collective lack of influence in comparison to Trump's showmanship, arrived in a staggered, slightly delayed sequence. This unintentional or orchestrated delay emphasized their reactive role. In photographs and video coverage, Trump's position remained central, while the EU leaders were positioned slightly to the side, reinforcing a visual narrative of subordination and expectation. Even minor details, where chairs were placed, who stood where, and the relative spacing, conveyed psychological hierarchy, signaling that Europe was entering the room on Trump's terms, not their own. From the outset, Trump employed his signature pacing and attention control techniques. He opened with statistics, dropping NATO defense spending numbers immediately. Germany was spending 1.84% of GDP, far below the 3% target Trump had demanded repeatedly in previous years. By framing the conversation around these numbers, Trump forced European leaders into a reactive posture, defending or justifying their current commitments. Each interruption, pointed question, or direct glance served as a subtle reminder of the US's expectations and the consequences of non-compliance. The content of Trump's initial remarks combined data, humor, and psychological pressure. He highlighted contributions of various EU member states, often juxtaposing their current spending against the perceived US standard. These comparisons were carefully crafted to evoke both embarrassment and urgency, ensuring that EU leaders understood the strategic stakes and the narrative of American dominance. Trump's repeated reference to percentages and deadlines kept the conversation structured around measurable obligations rather than abstract ideals, leaving little room for European leaders to shift focus or deflect responsibility. Trump's style in this segment demonstrated mastery of conversational control. By strategically interrupting at key moments, 23 times according to observers, he prevented EU leaders from establishing their own narratives. Each interruption was timed to reinforce his points, redirect attention, or subtly assert superiority. By controlling the floor, Trump created an environment where European representatives had to defend, explain, and commit, rather than freely negotiate or propose alternatives. The visual presentation also reinforced the narrative. Trump's gestures, eye contact, and body positioning were deliberate. Leaning forward, pointing at charts, or glancing at his watch signaled impatience or authority, conveying to both the participants and the global audience that the US was setting the agenda. Cameras captured these moments meticulously, amplifying the narrative internationally. The US, under Trump's leadership, was dominant, and European partners were operating within constraints defined by American terms. Trump also leveraged real-time psychological cues. Subtle actions, nodding at compliant responses, leaning back when leaders hesitated, or exchanging quick glances with aides, reinforced hierarchy and influence. These cues, while imperceptible to many attendees, communicated a constant assessment of obedience, compliance, and performance. European leaders, aware of global scrutiny and media coverage, were acutely conscious of these signals, adding pressure to comply with Trump's framing. Substantively, the conversation revolved around defense spending, NATO obligations, and future strategic commitments. Trump emphasized that European nations must increase contributions to 3% of GDP, framing it as a matter of fairness, reciprocity, and global security. By combining statistical evidence, historical context, and personal emphasis, he created a narrative that European leaders could not easily dismiss. Every objection or justification offered by EU representatives was met with pointed questions, repeated data, or humor that simultaneously disarmed and pressured them, keeping the conversation under US control. Beyond numbers, Trump also subtly managed alliances within the European delegation itself. By singling out Germany, France, or other key players at different moments, he created mild divisions or competitions, encouraging individual accountability while reinforcing his overall authority. These techniques ensured that the EU was fragmented psychologically, reducing the likelihood of a unified pushback and making compliance more probable. Media optics remained central. Photographs showed Trump centrally located, gesturing to charts, while European leaders appeared attentive but reactive. Video coverage emphasized pauses, facial expressions, and the timing of nods, creating a global narrative that reinforced the power dynamic. The US was in command and Europe was responding. Social media immediately amplified these visuals, portraying Trump as assertive and Europe as under pressure, a narrative that was consistent across news outlets and platforms. The segment also highlighted Trump's ability to control both substance and symbolism. He not only addressed defense spending but did so in a way that underscored American leadership, strategic priorities, and the consequences of inaction. Each statement about NATO obligations, financial contributions, or timeline enforcement was both a policy directive and a symbolic assertion of US leverage. European leaders had to respond not only to the facts, but to the implicit power structure, where compliance equaled favor and delay or resistance could be construed as weakness. Importantly, Trump also manipulated time and sequencing to reinforce dominance. Frequent glances at his watch, deliberate pacing of questions, and selective attention to responses created a subtle but continuous sense of urgency and evaluation. European leaders, aware that their reactions were being scrutinized live and through media coverage, experienced both psychological pressure and strategic framing that shaped their decisions and responses. In conclusion, the entrance and engagement of EU leaders during the Alaska summit was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of performative diplomacy and psychological control. Trump's approach combined visual hierarchy, Putin and allies first, Europe secondary. Statistical leverage, NATO spending figures and historical context. Psychological pressure, interruptions, pacing, gestures, and selective attention. Media amplification, strategic camera angles, and framing for global narrative impact. Negotiation control, ensuring the EU responded to US terms rather than dictating the agenda. The segment not only secured Trump's immediate objectives, reinforcing US expectations for defense spending and contributions, but also broadcast globally a message of American dominance, demonstrating that in high-stakes diplomacy, perception, psychology, and performance are as critical as the formal agreements themselves. By the end of this phase, it was clear that Trump had engineered both compliance and spectacle, leaving European leaders humbled and the global audience acutely aware of the US's commanding position in the room. Following the dramatic arrival and engagement with EU leaders, the Alaska summit entered what could be described as Trump's masterclass in strategic diplomacy. This phase of the meeting was designed to consolidate his influence, control the agenda, and demonstrate both to participants and the global audience that the United States, under his leadership, was decisive, dominant, and unyielding. At this stage, Trump had already established several key psychological levers. He had positioned Putin as the favored ally, guided Zelensky into compliance, and reminded European leaders of their obligations. Now, the focus shifted to maximizing leverage, enforcing compliance, and asserting total control over both the content and optics of the negotiations. The tools he employed during this phase illustrate a combination of narrative control, timing, and performative authority rarely seen in modern diplomacy. Trump began by reiterating the central message: Europe must increase defense spending and meet obligations to NATO. This was not a simple reminder, but a repeated, multifaceted tactic. By continually emphasizing the 3% GDP target, comparing current contributions to historical averages, and referencing previous pledges, he forced the EU leaders into a reactive mode, constantly defending or justifying their positions. The repetition of core messages is a classic psychological technique designed to anchor the audience's attention, reinforce expectations, and diminish resistance. Simultaneously, Trump exercised agenda control with remarkable precision. Unlike traditional summits where multiple topics are discussed concurrently, he strategically chose which issues to address, in what order, and for how long. While defense spending dominated the discussion, debates over Ukraine, trade, or climate policy were either skipped entirely or briefly touched on, only to emphasize the US's leverage. By controlling the agenda and sequence, Trump ensured that all discussions reinforced the narrative of US authority and European accountability. A hallmark of this masterclass was Trump's manipulation of timing and pacing. Deliberate pauses, shifts in tone, and strategic glances at aides or documents created a psychological rhythm that guided the reactions of EU leaders. These techniques subtly communicated urgency, evaluation, or approval, compelling the Europeans to respond within Trump's framework. Each interruption, question, or nod was both a negotiation tactic and a visual signal of dominance. Another dimension of Trump's strategy was media orchestration. Throughout the masterclass, cameras captured his gestures, expressions, and timing to reinforce his public image as in control and commanding. Leaning forward to emphasize points, gesturing toward charts, or signaling impatience with his watch, Trump crafted a visual narrative that would be replayed globally. The strategic integration of media optics into negotiation dynamics amplified his influence, ensuring that the summit would be perceived as a US-driven victory even before agreements were formalized. Trump's interactions with individual EU leaders further demonstrated his psychological mastery. By singling out Germany, France, or other prominent member states for pointed questions, comparisons, or even light teasing, he created a dynamic where each nation felt directly accountable. These techniques fostered mild competition, internal pressure, and a sense of responsibility, ensuring that collective European negotiations were fragmented and more easily influenced. The result was a calculated imbalance of power, where Trump maintained central authority while European leaders navigated both compliance and optics simultaneously. During this phase, Trump also leveraged direct negotiation pressure. He emphasized consequences for noncompliance, including potential shifts in US policy, reduced support, or public censure. By framing obligations in both tangible and symbolic terms, he reinforced the importance of meeting US expectations. Each statistic, historical comparison, or pointed remark was carefully chosen to maximize psychological impact while maintaining a facade of cordial engagement. Trump's approach to multitasking was another key factor. While leading the discussion with European leaders, he also maintained strategic peripheral awareness, checking documents, signaling aids, and occasionally making phone calls. At one point, he even called Putin mid-meeting, subtly demonstrating external alliances and influence, while keeping European leaders guessing about US commitments and priorities. This tactic created a sense of strategic omnipresence, reinforcing that Trump was not only leading the conversation but also managing the broader geopolitical landscape in real time. A striking feature of this masterclass was Trump's ability to combine assertiveness with psychological subtlety. He exercised dominance without overt aggression, using language, pacing, and nonverbal cues to maintain control. His tone varied from casual humor to pointed seriousness, each shift reinforcing hierarchy and compliance. By managing both substance and perception, Trump ensured that European leaders felt the pressure to commit without overt coercion, a hallmark of high-level negotiation strategy. Furthermore, Trump's handling of disagreements exemplified his tactical agility. When EU leaders offered explanations, delays, or objections, he would strategically pivot, sometimes acknowledging their points briefly, other times immediately redirecting attention to a critical metric or commitment. This approach minimized opportunities for pushback, maintaining control over the narrative and outcomes. By guiding responses and framing objections, Trump ensured the discussion remained aligned with US objectives. Trump also displayed mastery in symbolic and performative elements. Gestures, seating arrangements, and physical spacing all reinforced hierarchy. The combination of verbal assertiveness, visual dominance, and media-aware performance created a scenario where the global audience, EU delegation, and other stakeholders perceived a clear power imbalance. Every element, from posture to hand movements to facial expressions, contributed to the overarching narrative. The US was decisive, strategic, and in command. By the conclusion of this segment, Trump had effectively secured the compliance and attention of European leaders. While formal agreements may have been negotiated in subsequent sessions, the masterclass itself had already delivered strategic outcomes. EU leaders understood their obligations, the US narrative of dominance was reinforced globally, and Trump's leadership image was enhanced both domestically and internationally. The combination of psychological leverage, media strategy, and agenda control had produced measurable and symbolic victories simultaneously. Finally, this segment of the summit highlighted broader lessons in modern diplomacy and negotiation. In high-stakes international contexts, the interplay of performance, psychology, media optics, and substantive negotiation is crucial. Trump's Alaska Summit Masterclass exemplified how a leader can integrate these elements to maximize leverage, secure compliance, and influence global perception. By blending assertiveness with subtlety, repetition with pacing, and symbolism with tangible policy demands, he transformed a standard diplomatic session into a demonstration of strategic dominance and effective influence.